This is On Diversity, a podcast series by the Institute of Policy Studies, Singapore. This is the second season, and I'm your host, Liang Kaixin. Today's episode is on diversity in elite schools, and we have IPS Dr Gillian Koh, Deputy Director of Research, and Paul Jerusalem, a master student at the NUS who studied in both a neighbourhood school and an elite school. Welcome to the podcast today. So my first question to Paul first. What's your experience like in both a neighbourhood school and elite school? And do you feel that there was any difference in socio-economic background for your classmates?
Between the neighbourhood and elite school, actually, so for context, I went to neighbourhood schools from primary school to secondary school. And then after my O-levels, I went to an elite school, or what people would call an elite school. In terms of socio-economic background, I think that I remember having a huge culture shock when I went to JC after my O-levels. And one of the big things I realized was that, something that most people expect is that people in elite schools all are very wealthy, are very rich, come from very well-heeled backgrounds. So something that surprised me was that actually there was a little more diversity than I expected in terms of socioeconomic status in JC. But of course, I think comparing that to my secondary school and primary school, I think people there were a lot more similar to each other. So the range in terms of their socioeconomic background was a lot closer to each other. And of course, I think within my friend group, there were people who lived in private property, but I would say that out of every 10 friends that I had, probably one or two of them stayed in private housing, whereas it's probably a lot more
diverse?
I'll backtrack a bit, but comparing that to the friends I had or the people that I knew in JC, I think it was probably something like 4 to 5 people who lived in HDBs per 10 people that I knew.
Okay. So Gillian, could you comment on this? I understand that you did a study on social capital back then. What do you learn about this phenomenon about elite schools?
Well, first is the definition of what elite schools are.
Sure,
and I think we believe that these elite schools are where, children who have done well in secondary school, in primary school, then graduate to secondary school. So these are schools that host high achievers. But then the question is raised as to how students enter primary schools which are reputed to create students who are high achievers. And I think the suspicion is that more and more so, in order to get into those primary schools that are reputed to create high achievers, you've got to have parents who have the means to help their children go to all sorts of enrichment classes in order to have that outcome of being the best performers in PSLE. So what we've learned is that there's that level of discomfort with how it may be a question of class that feeds into achievement, and then from achievement in primary school to secondary school, then achievement to JC and uni after that. This is exacerbated by the gifted education system that was very much in play from the 1980s onwards. And so the issue is, are elite schools really the repository of the people who are better heeled and therefore a representation of what we call parentocracy? Back to our research. What we discovered in a study in 2017 is that when we looked at the social networks, the friendships and social support that Singaporeans have on different things, whether it's getting advice, getting practical help, or actually getting support financially and maybe connections for jobs. We found that surprisingly, Singaporeans do have a healthy level of friendships across age, race, religion. But what was really absent was the relationship among people who live between these two very broad categories. People who live in public housing and private housing, there are much weaker ties than, say, across race, religion, and age. The second one was we found that there were weaker ties among people who would report that they have elite school backgrounds versus those who report that they don't have elite school backgrounds. So I think that's the worry. Let me finish quickly by saying that in 2018, the education minister of that time, Mr. Ong Ye Kung, had said that there was a perceptible reduction in the level of social mixing that was happening across class. And I think there have been many steps in government to try and ensure that, students in these so-called elite schools continue to be people who have diverse backgrounds and are there because of merit, and that merit is not a representation simply about whether they come from backgrounds where the parents have been well-heeled enough to send their kids to enrichment classes and therefore helping them get very good grades at PSLE.
Gillian, you raised a very interesting point about primary school, because I was from a normal primary school, but when I went to my JC, top 5 JC, I realized that I saw a lot of people who are from different schools, but they seem to know each other. And when I dug deeper, right, then I realized, oh my goodness, they're all from very good primary schools. Paul, do you realize that too?
Yeah, 100%. Actually, that was one of, I remember having realized that many people have known each other all the way back since primary school. And even if they didn't go to the same primary schools or the same secondary schools, it was often the case that people knew each other from church. And this is often the case with Catholic churches because of reasons, but also the tuition centers that they went to. There were people who, so most people who went to my JC went to single-sex secondary schools because that's what most so-called elite secondary schools were, right? But many of them also knew people of the opposite gender simply because they went to the same tuition centers. So earlier on, I think, Gillian, you raised a point about how people from different backgrounds would know the different kinds of resources that their kids need and what kinds of enrichment classes to send their kids to. And I think what I've noticed is that this is getting democratized, and people from democratized in the sense that even people from more humble backgrounds know the necessity of this in order to get by. But what tuition centers to go to, which ones are the good ones, I think that's something that's very much specific to your background. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think, there is that aspect of it. And when parents know that there are certain tuition centers or enrichment centers that will help their kids get the good grades, then it's a question of whether the parents have the finances to do that. So let's look at the flip side. I think this is where the effort of the self-help groups to uplift the children from disadvantaged families is very key. And hopefully that follows through from improving what would have been their regular trajectory in terms of achievement if they didn't have the help, that these children from disadvantaged families are helped through the self-help groups to sort of do better than what would be their expected achievement. So that's one has been in place, but that's one very, integral channel to mitigate against achievement being a reflection of parents' socioeconomic resources. The second one is actually upon entry itself to primary school. And I think you've seen the government over the years try to ensure that the entry to schools, and certainly the more what they call popular schools, which we could say would be the elite schools, the independent schools, from Rosyth to Methodist Girls, right, would be that provision is made for students with no affiliation to be able to enter these schools. So the Prime Minister had said, very many years ago, that there would be a reservation of a certain number of spaces in Phase 2C for students with no prior affiliation to the school.
We just saw that this year, right? I mean, the Education Minister just had an announcement.
Absolutely. So what was announced this year was that there would be more spaces made available, 40 at Phase 2C, in addition to the 20 at Phase 2B for those children of parent volunteers who be helping out in the school, and also, who are members of a clan association. So it tends to be, I think, let's pull it together, tends to be that some of these popular schools have a long history. And therefore, they are somewhat obliged to ensure that those who are affiliated to that history, be it faith-based associations or clan associations, should be allowed to have their children in there. But then what more can be done to ensure that children without an affiliation, but maybe live within the 1 km rule, would be able to enter? Then finally, that also means that where you live will make a difference. And insofar as these schools are located in estates where there's both public and private housing estates, then that works. But if these schools are just only in primarily private housing estates...
You mean Bukit Timah, right?
I don't know. Then it doesn't quite work. It doesn't quite work, because even at Phase 2C, if there were any spots left, there's still that 1 km rule. There's nobody who can come from one end of the island and go to the other end of the island to get to a popular school where there's absolutely no affiliation. So there are very many barriers to entry, but I think this year the Education Minister Chan Seng says we are more than aware of this, and we're going to take more steps now. We have to decide whether this is just too little, or it is at least some, measure to improve this, and we can talk about the other measures as well, at the other parts of the value chain.
Gillian, you have a good point here, because I have friends who have kids now, and they are trying to game the system. I even had one friend, she's selling her current house to move to Newton.
Wow.
Just so that she can get her kid into ACS.
Well, I think that's important to note. And if that is going to be the trend anyway, then look, why don't we then suggest that some of these schools which have a system to really optimize their students' potential, that they would be offered the opportunity to create branches across different parts of Singapore. Think of, Punggol, think of Sengkang, think of Tengah, which will be a new housing estate. Why can't popular school or elite school X create 2 more branches?
That's a cool idea.
So the question is whether you are then spreading out elitism. I don't think so. Or you are spreading out a good formula so that parents who are going to chase after it anyway have the assurance that their students, their kids are going to get a system that really does optimize their potential. So that's something to think about.
It almost kind of sounds like private tuition centers where a lot of them are like really big and having branches in shopping malls all over the island.
Yeah, so why not the Singapore education system, which has these popular schools, right, which are effective? If that's what parents want, and if that's an expression of their concern for their kids because they want the best for their kids, then why don't we go the way that the river flows and template the process and then spread it out? I think the argument against it was that
every school is a good school.
I was just about to say.
Yeah. So that's been the other formula that has been played out. Maybe it's the teachers that need to be dispersed. Then the teachers will bring the system. But is that right? Or is it the case of the students or a broader system that just is beyond one personality?
That's a very interesting provocation because I think from what I know, the teachers at my JC at least, it was an independent school, but it was...
It was a really good school.
It was a really, well, debatable according to some ministers.
Oh, I guess you have a clue now.
Well, no, but so what I know is that some teachers are hired directly by the school, and some of them, I don't know the percentage, but some of them are cycled through different schools. So I think teachers under the MOE have to cycle through like 6-year cycles and go from school to school. So those teachers under that scheme can't just stay put in one school. So I think that challenges the narrative that good schools, quote unquote good schools, have a certain caliber of teachers. And I think I have faith in like the teachers in our public education system. And I went to a government school, a government secondary school that had excellent teachers. So I think there's this myth of like the resources that so-called elite schools have, and whether or not it really is the case that these schools are more well-resourced in certain ways. I think there's this cultural element to the notion of good schools where we reify and add weight to our notions of like which schools are good schools, whether it be old boys networks or alumni networks, which are the same thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess the way forward on this is to try and pinpoint what it is that helps students optimize their potential, and then when you've pinpointed that, then you can have a conversation, a national conversation about this. And if we want to replicate that, then we've got to make it available to many more. But if it's actually not a very, palatable or a very good part about it, maybe it's because everybody's chasing after the same definition of intelligence, let's say. Let's just say, for argument's sake, and we don't want that, then we actually do want to go back to the original formulation of what every good school is a good school was. That basically, that each school is there, that is customized to the requirements of the type of children they're getting in that school, because it's in itself a function of the geography and the background of the students there, given that not every part of Singapore is equally diverse in the same way. It also is about ensuring that every school has its own peak of excellence. That it focuses on a certain type of intelligence, focus on a certain type of kind of discipline, or, whether it's robotics and coding, or whether it's arts, whether it's performing arts, whether it's sports, that each school would be calling out to parents and therefore students, because it's got something, a value X that it offers that's a bit different from another school down the road, and is something that, parents and the students want. Then that's a different formula for going forward. Then there is no one standard of what is excellent achievement, but several different standards. And you can see that the system allows for that. It's why we have the sports school, we have the science and technology school, we have the art school. But we need the coherence right through the system. Right now, we have everything going, and then the force of nature is really just to chiong, as they say, to do well for the PSLE, to only get to the popular schools, read elite schools or SAP schools, so that then you will be on a certain track to the best JCs and then to Yale NUS, right? Up till now. I know Paul is a graduate of Yale NUS, and he'll probably appeal for the sort of diversity that it is meant to represent at the highest tertiary level. Of course, the argument this year is that there will be more effort to recognize that diversity of interests and approach in education that Yale NUS stands for. So every part of the system has to be conscious of the diversity, not just in the input, but the output as well. And then everybody feels they can make choices, and have, that kind of freedom, that sense of agency that we want.
Okay, but Paul, then do you think there should be more affirmative actions in these kind of elite schools to improve the social mixing and have, more diversity in socioeconomic status?
Right. So I think that's a really big question to ask, because when it comes to affirmative action, I think many people are quite touchy about it, because there's this notion that people who require affirmative action probably do not, quote unquote, deserve it in the first place. And there's this notion of deservedness when it comes to how far up the ladder you climb, that I think many people are not comfortable with. So that's a really big question, and it's one that I find really complex. But I actually wonder if the step should be affirmative action in order to bring more people from more diverse backgrounds to higher places in the ladder, or maybe the ladder should be brought, to a lateral position rather than one that goes from bottom to the top. And that's a really big reimagination of what education can look like. And I think it points to what Dr. Gillian was saying about having different centers of excellence, which actually, in my experience, just to bring in another personal observation, is that even back when I was in school, there were so-called centers of excellence in different schools, and not just the popular schools, but also neighborhood schools and government schools. For example, I think the secondary school that I went to, I can't remember what exactly, but it was a center of excellence for one of the sciences. And there's also these awards that the MOE gives out to schools called the School Excellence Award and the School Distinction Award. And I remember at primary 6, after the PSLE, one of the reasons why I chose my school was that its choir got gold for the Singapore Youth Festival before, and I was like, okay, the School of the Arts would be too expensive for me. I couldn't afford the fees, so okay, I'll choose this school that had a good musical program. So how about we reimagine the values that we place on schools and think less about what school does better than the other in academics, but think of schools as serving students in expanding the different ways that they can achieve their full potential, not just in terms of academics or intellectual pursuits, but also sports and the arts.
Yeah, because that also is a form of intelligence. It also requires a lot of skills and discipline to achieve excellence in, that are useful for the full development of a person, but also for industry, And industry is getting less unidimensional in terms of, you got to be great at this particular discipline, and then you only have to do this. No, I think even as we talk about AI, we need people who are humanists, who have a sense of philosophy, moral ethics, even as they design code, right? And if you're not the person who can do that and design code, you work with people who can design code. You got to influence them as much as they influence you. So the world is becoming a place where if we just thought about education as being, something for not just civilization of the person, which is the most important part, but at least to as a channel to livelihoods. even the workplace demands that diversity. So I think that long gone are the days of a factory-like education system where there's just one dimension, you ace it, and then you go to work, and the work is just one-dimensional. That's gone. But back to the question of affirmative action, the story is told certainly of by Frederick Yeo, who is the principal of RI. Said that at the height of the debate on social mixing in 2018, certainly when the government said it was going to redouble its efforts to foster greater inclusion, social mixing, greater cultural understanding of Singaporeans with one another. Frederick Yeo of the Raffles Institution said that indeed there was less and less diversity in the background of the students there. 53% of his students lived in public housing, where previously it was about 80%. In the late Lee Kuan Yew's time, he would mention that in his final visit to RI. Now, the thing is this, he said that he actually does go to neighbourhood schools to try and recruit the best students, right, to convince them to put RI as their top choice when they get their PSLE results. And he said that the students, or more pointedly, the parents said, we don't think our children will feel that they can fit into that kind of RI setting. And so there is something more than just the grades that you need, but there's a sense that these popular schools, or rather elite schools, have a certain cultural box, cultural kind of framework.
Yes, indeed, Gillian.
Yeah,
it was actually my personal experience.
People don't want to go.
Yeah, because back then, I mean, that's many years ago, when we were choosing like secondary school and JC, right? Some of my friends, me included, we avoided choosing independent schools because we think that the students there are very rich and we wouldn't be able to fit in, and we would just be miserable and poor and we wouldn't be able to afford the school fees also. So I just didn't choose.
Yeah, so there's something cultural about it, and the question is that real or is that myth? And if it's real, what can we do about that? If it's myth, then you better disabuse people of that myth. I think when I was younger as well, there was a story about a Malay girl who was the top scorer in those days. They still put front page news who was the top scorer of PSLE, right? Was a Malay student, a Malay girl. And the big story was, why on earth did she not choose RI? There was a huge moral panic about this issue. But, the long and short of it was, she and her parents felt she would not be able to fit in. So it's not just a myth.
Paul,
I think there's a real issue that needs to be kind of dealt with, right?
Yeah, and I think when we think about these myths, right, I think one interpretation of myths is that it's a lie, or like that it's not actually true. And then another interpretation of it is that it's kind of this idea or a tale that people hold, and whether or not it's actually true, people give power to these myths by reiterating them. And in my experience, actually, like what Kaixin was saying was so relatable, because I remember when I was studying for my O-levels, my mindset in the beginning of my Sec 4 year was, okay, just do your best. The people in my school, most of the people who were considered to have done above average would go to a junior college that was in close proximity to my school. So that was kind of what I had in mind. And I had set Victoria Junior College as as a goal, because like the top scorers in my school would go to VJC. So that was something I had in mind. But in terms of looking at like what people consider the top three, which are Raffles, Hwa Chong, and ACS, I think there's this shroud of...
you forgot NJC.
Oh, NJC as well. Well, I lived in the East, so anything that was in Bukit Timah, I just didn't regard it. In fact, I didn't even this is a story for another day, but places like Serangoon Gardens and Bukit Timah didn't have a place in my mental map of Singapore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where the class divide is emerging. The cultural divide is what drives it. There's a perception and then it's reinforced. Those people living in those places, they're rich, they speak differently. Maybe their interests are just too far from ours. They don't understand how we live, which is, and then the people living there might be like, what
are you talking about, man?
What are you talking about? Aren't we all the same? Which is not true. And so there has to be greater understanding. And we don't want to be a class-ridden society, because our foundational myth, right? There's the word myth about Singapore as a nation, is that we are an egalitarian society. So I think we have to push against, these sociological and cultural forces. And it's a question of what the people who have done better do to reach out. It isn't what the people on the other side do in order to reach in. It's the other way, and it has to work that way. But facts are facts. So let's just cite the fact that the government has said that over the years, over very many generations, people who are born in the lowest 1/5 of the income sort of ladder have 14% chance of going to the top 1/5 of that
social
income
mobility,
ladder.
right?
So there is social mobility, and some people have beat the odds. It's still only 14%. Hello, but it's better. It's decent compared to many developed countries. It's decent. It's actually even better. So this 14% and many more, they have to think about where they've come from and can they reinforce a system that's allowed for that social mobility. I think that's quite important. But they mustn't do it with a language of being patronizing. I tell you how you have to do it this way, huh? That's not going to work, because it'll just come as, hoity-toity and, kind of very arrogant, and you're so atas from the people that you are trying to reach.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But what do you think? Because you mentioned about egalitarian, right? But the other cornerstone of Singapore society is meritocracy also,
yes.
right?
And so that meritocracy is a very important point, because it's regardless of race, language, religion, or class, that you will be, able to achieve whatever merit, and you are rewarded based on that merit. So now the thing is to have continuous meritocracy, so that it's not just based on your PSLE results, but ongoing. So people can switch, can change, can climb up the ladder at different points. Some are late bloomers, so be it. Some are great in the arts, so be it. So that's quite an important thing to do in order to facilitate constant mobility. So that's constant meritocracy that goes beyond exam meritocracy.
I like the distinction that you raise about constant meritocracy versus exam meritocracy, because I was actually about to say that one thing that people have commonly critiqued about this notion of meritocracy is the fact that on paper it's supposed to reward people fairly based on their merit, but in reality so many different social, cultural and socio-economic factors come into play, like as we've discussed earlier on today, the amount of resources that parents have in order to guide them along the system, how to navigate it. So I really like what you've raised about how constant meritocracy and
but some people will say, this is a constant treadmill and rat race, then so stressful. But actually, they have to look at how that allows them to continually progress and be rewarded. And it also means that their fellow citizens, the younger generation, also has the opportunity to, progress. But flip side is always what happens if you fall down? What happens if your kids don't make it, But actually where your kids are, they're not going to fall well below that unless something very severe happens in their life, something very unfortunate happens, So it's, this continuous and constant meritocracy is probably, going to serve many more rather than hurt. So, but I want to be realistic. People will be, wow, then life is a constant rat race,
I think earlier on you mentioned this idea of people being able to beat the odds to come to a different outcome. And I think the notion of beating the odds and doing better than is expected of me is something that I had deeply internalized when I was back in my school years, in secondary school and JC. And it was a myth that I held on to dearly. And the whole coming against all odds to make it. And now that I am much further away from my mental state back then, I'm realizing, apart from beating the odds, why are the odds there in the first place, right?
Yeah, but then the point we're trying to make is then you have every form of agency, you have every right to, in your sphere of influence, ensure that you make sure that those odds are not stacked against anyone because of how well resourced their parents are. I think that's the point, that, therefore, as I said, those who have made good owe a duty, right, to everyone else to ensure that system prevails so that we are a nation of opportunities.
Going back to an earlier point when you talk about the gifted program, so, I actually have a friend who's a tuition teacher, and he specializes in helping kids get into the program, the gifted program. So, that's really unfair, right? Like, if your parent has a lot of resources, you get a kid to the tuition center to train you to ace the test, and then you get into the program which has a lot more resources than other programs, than normal schools.
Yeah. Well, if you, over the years, of course, that's been asked of government ministers, don't you know that people are trying to game the system? The response is always that this is really a raw IQ test. The enrichment centers that are selling you this program and taking your money away, they're just, the argument is that they are not really making an impact. So the test is geared to, is just to pick up raw processing power of a kid's brain. Now, we have to remember that before this gifted program was introduced, there was on the other side also a lot of voices saying, hello, why can't my child, who is seemingly differently gifted, why can't my child just, get to a more enriched program than go through everything that everybody else is doing? So, because the argument has been in Singapore to help everybody achieve their highest potential, because we cannot invest and, overlook this talent. We can't afford it as a nation. So we must make sure that there is a program geared to every child's innate ability or studied and hard work ability, right?
Interesting. Are you talking about streaming also?
No. So streaming is actually that. And if you look at the other side of the ladder, IPS has published a book on the ITE system. Because of that streaming, of course, it's got pejorative connotations, but because of that streaming, there are children who learn differently, who are more vocationally oriented, who are not going to be theoretical about things, who need the hands-on kind of training. They have a system that brings the best out of them. Right? And so you'll see that actually the government has over the years invested a lot in, the ITE system. And in fact, in the book that we published, written by Dr. Law Song Sing, he highlights how there are many graduates from ITE who became entrepreneurs and who have done very well in life. And over the years, I think we've also seen that ITE graduates are now it's permeable, able to go to poly, able to go to uni. So that's the thing, many bridges across the different pathways to enable it. So the streaming has a bad name, but if we try to understand what was the rationale before, it's just to make sure that it will reduce the dropout rate from school and ensure that even at the sort of certain level, students will still have skills to help them create sustainable livelihoods.
I think Paul has quite a strong opinion about this, right? About
Putting
streaming.
me on the spot. Well, so I had written an article back when I was in undergrad. After news about the streaming system being abolished came out, and I was very supportive of it. And I think I'm definitely I haven't done scholarly research around streaming and its impacts at a wider societal level, but I was really hopeful, or I am still really hopeful about this. What they called it was the abolition of streaming, and I'm not quite sure yet how they are going to operationalize it, but I'm really hopeful just because of the fact that my experience moving through primary and secondary school and JC was that people within different streams in the same school, they have opportunities for mixing, but because most of your social interactions are going to be with your classmates or with your CCA mates, there's going to be a certain limitation to how much you can interact with each other. And another thing is also, certain beliefs or ideas about people from different streams. I'm not sure about whether these are ideas that kids these days still hold on to. And I would like to imagine that we become a much more inclusive and egalitarian society. But yeah, I think even despite MOE's efforts, what happens on the ground can sometimes be a bit different.
Are you alluding to self-esteem issues?
There is that, but there's also this idea that, this person from Express One, they won't understand us. This person from Normal, they won't don't go and be friends with them lah. You're so extra for what? That kind of thing. Yeah, it's the whole
that's really giving us a feel of the vibe in the schoolyard. Wow, I think you see, when you create a system, the simpler it is, the easier it is to operationalize and implement. So, there's always a tendency not to make it so complex.
Yeah.
But I think we've worked with this system for so many years, and the desire is actually to reform it, blunt the edges of that meritocracy so that it's not so extreme. And not so exclusivist in creating those pathways. So I think with the kind of grading system for the PSLE, that will blunt it a bit. Then it'll be up to the secondary schools to sort of make their pitch to their students, because you're all four A's. You got 4 A's. There's a whole range of different types of schools that you can go to, right? And so how will the different schools with the different attitudes, different emphasis, different orientation make their pitches to those students? But on the other side, where you have assumption pathway for those who, have not been able to pass the PSLE twice. Then for them, the vocational skills are important. The ITE track is important. And so the thing is this, to have diverse tracks that are equally valuable and equally valued by parents and students, because they have different aspirations and the students have different passions and abilities. And I think this COVID pandemic has taught us that while we think of essential workers as being lower paid workers, right? They're actually even more valued than ever, because if we didn't have them, what would all of us atas professionals do without it, right? So we all need each other. And the wage, as well as the credentials that have led to that wage, are not good proxies for the value, talent, abilities, and the passions of all of us. So how can Singapore be a place where ITE is viewed in equal standing as okay, I'm being extreme here, as going to, SIT. Yeah, or a university like NUS, which is very academic. It's just different. Yeah, but equally valuable. So the ITE to SIT track, which is vocational, you still end up at tertiary level if you want to, is just as valuable as, what we know now as elite school to elite JC to NUS.
Just different pathways, right?
So it will take us a while to do that, but hopefully that's the end goal. Because if we don't set the mark, we will never get there, right? But if we set the mark, maybe we hit 50% of our aspiration and goal and vision, within a decade or two. But we must set the mark. So it's up to Paul, young people like him.
I really like what you say about blunting the edges of meritocracy, because I think it's easy to dream and be idealistic and utopian about it, which is my proclivity. I tend to be very I want to dream a world where going to ITE means just as much as going to NUS. But oftentimes the realities of the world disappoint those of us who are more utopian in that respect. But I do agree so much with the fact that all of us have very different capabilities. And if we are more academically minded, it doesn't mean that we are it doesn't mean that we have inherent qualities over someone who is more technically oriented.
Yeah, think of nursing, for instance.
Yeah.
And, if you have the heart to nurse, be a nurse, heart for caring, and you are detail oriented, maybe you start at ITE, you go to poly, and you're very good in your practice. Does that make you any worse off than if, you went to elite school, went to JC, and went to the nursing school at NUS, you're looking at theory and you're looking at, better ways of doing nursing. But does that make you, either of them less, are you able to weigh up the value of either of them and say one is better than the other? It's just a different thing, and you're doing different parts of the value chain. So I think over time we're going to see that, the nurse who spent 30 years in the neonatal ward, who really has an instinct about what is happening with the little preemies, can actually reflect and say, these are things that maybe we could try out, because I've done this with 30% of the cases who I've encountered. Then you throw that to the more theoretical, kind of academic research-oriented nursing head who's got that training, and also the professors in nursing school. Then because they got those insights, they might develop a new treatment, which then the practice-oriented nurses can try out. So you can see how that interaction happens. And neither is more valuable than the other.
So I think that, the amount of nursing theory that one studies doesn't necessarily equate to the quality of the care that they are able to provide patients, right? And I want to be utopian about thinking about how someone who goes to a certain school or certain tertiary track should be just as valued in society as someone who has gone to another track. But I think the way, since I'm relatively still fresh off the system and still in job searching kind of vicinity mode, I think many of us in Singapore, the ways in which we think about education is very tied to the occupations that we end up in.
And the credentials.
Yeah,
so
and the
we're
credentials.
Still talking about one area of nursing, right? So there's a pecking order, right?
And also the salary. I think employers are not looking at how good the quality of care you're providing is. Many of them, they have certain they would pay you a certain amount based on your educational background, based on whether you have a diploma or degree. So I think these things really complicate.
And it still matters, right?
Yeah. But once you enter, then hopefully with the continuous meritocracy, your performance is being recognized, and you have progressive enough HR management techniques, to suss out who's actually creating that value. And in this case of the example of nursing, which is so key now during pandemic, is really about that care and insight, to provide a system of care that will help.
True that. Okay, I just have one last point I want to ask both of you, and that's the most controversial actually.
Oh no.
Which is the debate about the SAP schools.
Yes, your pointed question is?
Yes,
Don't make it
everyone...
so open-ended because we cannot answer this very difficult question otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about resources and independent schools. So obviously the SAP schools also have a lot of resources. And there's always a lot of debate about it, especially there's not enough diverse students over there. So maybe I go to Gillian first. What do you think? How do we help SAP schools to increase diversity over there?
Well, I think this is an issue that's been brought up time and again, and it doesn't feel in the public discourse that it's been settled very well, especially among those who are not within the SAP system.
I must declare I was from SAP.
Right. So maybe you should offer some suggestions. But I think the starting point's been that you have to recognize the deep cultural background of these SAP schools. But then the question is, why is it that there's no change to the idea that only the top achievers can really qualify to go to SAP schools, because you need the brains to do the acquisition of, language at a higher level, as well as then manage all the other subjects. So that's a real question, because it's also then tied, therefore, with the cultural heritage to a higher level grasp of Chinese. So it's higher Chinese that these SAP schools offer. I think one quick thing I say quick, of course not. But maybe the boards of these SAP schools have to look at the new era, because these are the key stakeholders. If they don't change, I don't think the government can even contemplate any kind of change, because the government recognizes those deep cultural roots and ballast that they offer. So will the boards of SAP schools take a look at today's world? There's the past, so they want the Chinese for the cultural ballast, but there's the future where, graduates of their schools, if they had the exposure to people with other cultural backgrounds, if they had great social networks from school with people who are Malay, who have been able to do the higher level Malay, right? Or higher level Tamil or Hindi or Bengali or whatever, they had time, 6 years in the same IP school, right? Then don't you think that these graduates of what used to be SAP schools that are now reformulated would be graduates who can win in this world which is still highly globalized, which is in an emerging Asia, we talk about the Asian century, it's still going to happen in spite of the pandemic, is a place of great cultural diversity. So why will they not see that the success of their graduates and the future of SAP schools lies in its ability, their ability to foster effective cross-cultural communication among Asian cultures? Then the first thing they would do would be to say, we're actually going to very seriously offer, a higher level language option for language X. And then you are going to go out and recruit students with that background. And they're not going to be the marginal 3 students in that one SAP school who then have to go to Newton to do the classes and then come back, you see. So, so I think if they did that systematically and really, I'm an advocate here, make that adjustment for what is the future, not what is the past. And then, we could crack this nut.
My experience was that I was in SAP schools for 10 years. So I actually didn't have any friends from other races. And the first time I had classmates who are Malay or Indian, when it was when I was in JC. So I think that's quite a big criticism of this system that you are stuck in.
Yeah, the spare three minorities would be Indians who are acing their Mandarin, right?
Yes. Yeah. What about Paul? What do you think?
Well, so I never went to SAP schools because one, I'm Filipino, and two, I took Chinese because my parents didn't realize I could have been exempted, but I took Chinese and was never good enough at it to actually take higher mother tongue. So nope, I had never gone to SAP schools, but among my friends who did go to SAP school, the common refrain, similar to what Kaixin has said, was that they never really had many friends beyond their co-ethnics, right? So that's one problem already at a societal level. But I think this discussion reminds me of how I was really shattered when I was in primary school and did a gifted education program test and didn't get it. But on hindsight, I'm actually really glad that I didn't, because I think the kinds of people that I interacted with were a lot closer to the median like the average Singaporean, right? Which was especially important as a second generation immigrant. So it could help me socialize to like Singaporean society. But back to SAP schools. Yeah, like, I don't know, like, I think earlier on, as Dr. Gillian, you were talking about your idea of what this could look like. I was thinking about, why actually can't we just decentralize? Like SAP could be a program rather than centralized in certain schools where kids wouldn't really have much exposure to kids of other races. Why couldn't we decentralize it and make it a program that students from all schools could take?
Yeah, because I think it's that balance that we try to strike, which is the balance between past and present, the history and the cultural part.
Yeah, some of the SAP schools, they are really proud of their Chinese heritage.
That's right.
And they have all these like Chinese school songs and all that.
So it's balancing between the cultural and a more civic republican ideal. Yeah, so it's a balance between past and present and the future. And, then for you, would you then decentralize and disperse this around the country? Or would you, like, for me, work with the current framework and introduce the diversity in? Which is easier to do? I don't know. But I think it has to start with a conversation from the key stakeholders of the SAP schools, though. They themselves have to want to do it, because their current existence is a recognition of the deep value that's given to their cultural ballast, right? That Singapore has. And you see, the formula of Singapore as a nation is really that you have 4 overlapping circles with an overlapping area, right? Yeah, so it's very hard if you want to scrap something, then why you don't scrap something else? So let's not talk about scrapping, but let's introduce more diversity within each. And then that overlapping center will actually grow. So I think envisioning Singapore in the future is about how to create that overlapping bit to widen it, to broaden it, and create more diversity. But we do it in the midst and recognition of the sociological forces are to everybody go into their close circles and just plow towards their own interests. So we got to... It's not just a foregone conclusion, not going to happen all on its own. But
not overnight, right?
Not overnight, yeah. But we must have that vision and that strategy, then do it, you see. But it's no good you and I talking about it, Paul. I mean, you have one formula, I have one formula, and Kaixin is trying to moderate. But it's like, will some of these ideas be discussed further? I think that's the challenge.
Do you have anything else to add?
I certainly agree that like it doesn't have to be an all or nothing, black or white kind of approach, and we can take baby steps and think of ways of reforming existing systems in order to introduce what our end goal is, right? So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. I think we're almost done here.
Yeah, I would say that, it's quite interesting that Paul mentioned his background and, that diversity of, integrating immigrants and their children, and people, who come from different lands, I think that's yet another challenge. And so, schools have to be also a platform that enables that to happen. And so this openness is something that defines us, and we mustn't, lose it. So everything that is just a natural tendency, we kind of fight against it so that we can maintain that openness and broaden and enlarge that overlapping circle. Yeah, which doesn't scrap the 4 circles, right? But it actually recognizes their existence, their value, but says you must broaden it, that overlapping bit, so that we have a common experience and we're comfortable talking to each other. Now, the 4 circles are inadequate because they don't capture class, which is what we're talking about today. And if class overlaps with any of those circles, we're done for. And so that's why we have to deal with class and make sure that regardless of race, language, religion, or class, everybody will feel that regardless of their starting point, they're able to kind of progress based on their talents, the work, and their passion. Yeah.
Thanks, Gillian. Thanks for the conclusion. Thanks, everyone. I would like to thank my guests, Gillian and Paul, for their time today.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Gillian.
So good.
Thanks, you all for listening in. See you on the next episode of On Diversity. On Diversity is a podcast inspired by the Institute of Policy Studies Managing Diversity's research program. Please follow or subscribe to the On Diversity podcast to get notified when we have a new episode. You can visit our website ipscommons.sg for more info.